All right, thanks for coming, everybody. I would like to introduce Josh Wilson on his talk today titled Big Bird, Harnessing AI and Big Data for Bird Identification in Drone Imagery. But before we get started, I'd like to do an acknowledgement of country. The University of Queensland acknowledges the traditional owners and the custodianship of the lands on which we meet. We pay our respect to the ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. We recognize their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. With that, let Josh take it away.
Cool. Thanks, Zach, and thanks for the introduction. Today I'm going to talk about one of the chapters of my PhD. My PhD in general was looking at reducing the barriers to using drones to monitor birds. And I worked in a lab with Richard Fuller and Tatsuya Amano here at UQ, and my project was also supported by the Queensland Radar Study Group and the Modern Bay Foundation. What I'm about to present today has been submitted and is currently under revision, so hopefully that paper will be well.
Use the mouse to click on the screen once, and now try and click it.
Maybe there. Okay. Cool. So this is a very generic slide, but it's basically just highlighting the biodiversity crisis, which I'm sure we're very aware of. We're all very aware of. So we're seeing massive declines in global wildlife populations, and we need to act very quickly to arrest that, not only for the wildlife itself, but also for the ecosystem services that they provide to humans. So if we, in order to kind of act and to underpin these conservation efforts, we need to monitor wildlife, and we need to know their abundance and distribution. And that's kind of what my work's been looking at. So how can we more effectively monitor wildlife so that we can develop more effective conservation actions based on that monitoring effort? So one species that we often turn to when we're looking at ecosystems is birds. And that's because they're a really good indicator species. They inhabit a lot of different niches. They're really well studied, and they have a lot of really passionate birders out there collecting data. So we use them to look at, to indicate the health of ecosystems. But sometimes it can be really hard to monitor birds. For example, they can aggregate in really large groups, or they can inhabit inaccessible areas. So in those cases, we can use technology to overcome those barriers. For example, we can use aerial surveys, but sometimes manned aircraft surveys can be expensive, they can be logistically difficult, and they can be dangerous as well. So recently, researchers have been using drones to monitor birds, and that's what you're seeing on this slide here. This 2021 study went out, they flew the drone over this island site, took photos, and then grouped those photos together into what's called an orthomosaic. So it's an accurate representation of that island. And then they went through and counted the birds. And that's currently one of the major barriers to using drones to survey birds. That counting process can take a very long time and consume a lot of resources. So it's really limiting the uptake of drones for monitoring wildlife in general, and in this case, birds. So in this paper, they did it with 5 people, and it took 21 days. So if you're paying those people, that's a pretty significant cost to your project. They developed a computer vision tool to count the birds. So there's 4 species of birds at this site, and they were able to count those birds in 4.5 hours. So that shows the benefit of using these computer vision tools in comparison to using these manual methods. So as you can see, we've already started to kind of make progress towards developing these computer vision tools. But I identified 3 main barriers that process is currently facing. The first one is that a lot of the tools that currently exist are very narrow in their context. When I say context, I mean biological context, so what species they encompass, environmental context, so how many different habitats they focus on, and digital context, so different image resolutions, different image properties. And that means that those networks don't generalize well, or those computer vision tools don't generalize well to other scenarios. So there's a lot of resources going into developing a network that might work really well in that specific context, but other researchers can't pick up these tools, and other practitioners can't pick up these tools and use them in their own environments, their own context. So that's one of the barriers to this sort of technology being used more broadly. And that has begun to be addressed. So Weinstein et al. In 2022, they reached out to researchers across the globe and grouped a bunch of these independent studies together and trained a computer vision tool to detect the birds in these drone images. So the data came from 15 countries, had 57,000 birds in it across 37 species. So that's a lot broader context. However, this study only labelled them as birds or background. And we know that for conservation, we really need more detailed information than that, so we can target our conservation to specific species that might be more threatened. So what we need to start doing is making these tools be able to provide more fine-scale details, like what species are the birds, maybe what age, roughly what age they are, maybe they're a juvenile or an adult bird, information like that. So that's kind of the second barrier. And the third barrier, which no one's really addressed so far, is that these tools aren't accessible to everyday practitioners that don't have computational resources and that don't have the technological skills to kind of use a computer vision machine learning network. That's a pretty high barrier to entry. So the third barrier is that people are developing these tools and they're open source and the models are available, but for an everyday practitioner to grab one of these tools and use it, it's a really high barrier to entry. So these tools aren't really being adopted on that kind of more everyday practitioner level. So I wanted to address these three issues. So my method was to assemble a data set encompassing broad context. So there's 6 steps, that's the first step. The second step was to annotate those images with those fine scale details that we want, so species, age, category, information like that. And then there's a pre-processing step where we basically take those images and process them so that they can be viewed by the network and use it to train the network. Then we train the network, we test its performance, and that's to give practitioners an indication of what sort of performance they can expect in different contexts. And then we deploy it, so we make it free and easily accessible for practitioners. So the first step, assemble. I used 2 different methods to create this data set. The first method was my own field work. So I went out and used a structured method where I launched the drone up, flew out above flocks of birds at 120 meters, took 3 photos, rotating the drone 120 degrees each time, then lowered it by 10 meters, took 3 more photos and kept doing that until we saw some signs of disturbance or we got to 10 meters altitude. So that gets quite a structured data set that kind of forms the foundation of this data set. I took photos as well with a ground camera so that we could identify the different species that were present at the site. But I also sent out about 100 emails to different researchers and asked them to contribute existing imagery that they already had. I didn't want anyone going out and trying to get more images, but if they already had images, I just asked them to send it through. And the scientific community is great, and we got lots of images sent through. So that was unstructured data. It was often only at 1 altitude or containing only 1 species. But it really enabled me to expand the context of the data set and encompass a much broader range of environments and species and digital context as well. So the data set ended up, 16 people contributed. We got images from all 7 continents, 11 countries. We labeled 1,867 images, which is 36,000 birds. And we got 82 species. So the 82 species is the really important bit for me. I wanted it to work really well across that broad biological context and be able to tell the difference between these different species. So here's a look at that data set. So the top kind of plot shows the different species and the number of instances we had for each of those species. And then I've got little images up the top representing the family of those birds. And then down the bottom, we have a few different metrics that describe the data set. So the pose of the birds or the posture of the birds, whether they were flying or resting or another posture that didn't fit into those two categories. The middle one is the ground sampling distance, which is the resolution of the image. So most of our images were really high resolution, but we had a wide range of resolutions there as well. And the bottom right here, letter D, is the age. Most of our birds were adult birds, but we did have some juveniles and some chicks in the data set as well. So here's an example of one of the images. This one was contributed by Roxanne Francis, who's an Australian researcher as well. And this is a massive flock of Australian pelican. This one is from Cesar over in Chile. This is Chilean flamengo. So we've got juveniles and adults as well. It's quite cool to see. And this one's Gentoo penguin, so from Antarctica, contributed by Christian. So we went through and labeled all of the birds in these images, and a lot of people helped me out with this. Nicola's here today, Sam Longtop, and Sophie Rawson also helped. Labeling the data. It took a long time, but basically it's just placing a box around each of these birds and then describing the bird as well. So we used a tool called Label Me, and these are the different tags that we associated with each label. The common name, their taxonomic description, and then the posture of the birds, whether it's resting, flying, or other, the age class, whether it's adult, juvenile, or chick, and whether it was obscured by foliage or not. So you can kind of see that in this figure here. We've got the 3 different postures up the top, and down the side here, we've got the 3 different age categories for Australian pelican. So then we did that pre-processing step. So we split each of these images into 800 by 800 patches. That's just to enable it to fit onto the graphics processing unit where you train these tools. And then we made a massive table, essentially, which said for each of these patches, what species is in the patch, what posture it's in, and how many pixels is that bird encompassing, basically describing each bird in the patch. And then we used what's called constraint optimization. So you basically take this data and give this algorithm a task. So equally sample all the different species from this data set. And it samples it in the best way possible so that you get the most equal number of each different species, for example. So we wanted an equal number of each species. And then within each species, we wanted an equal number in each pose category. And an equal number of pixels. And that's just to try and make the data set as diverse as possible so that you have as unbiased data as you can between all those different categories. We also split our data into 3 different data sets, a training data set, which you use to train the model, a testing data set, which tests the performance of the model during training, so that we know when the performance of the model stops improving and we can stop training. And then a validation data set, which was novel images that weren't in the training data at all. And that's to test how the data set performs in a new context, or a general context. Okay, so then we trained the network. The top left here is just a figure of the network structure we used. It's called FastRCNN. It's really popular. It was developed in 2017. It's used by Facebook, Tesla, all those companies as well. Although I'm sure they're using more advanced things than this as well now. But it basically takes your image and learns over time during the training how to highlight objects of interest within that image, and then how to place the box around each of those objects and classify them into different classes. For me, that's different species and age categories. So, for example, royal spoonbill adult would be one of the categories. And during training, we performed augmentations so that to increase the diversity of our data. So we flipped the images around, changed their, distorted their photometrics a little bit, operations like that. Training took 3 days on my GPU, and yeah, at which point the performance stopped improving. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the metrics we use to describe performance. This curve is called a precision recall curve, and you see it all the time in computer vision tools. Precision is the number of correct detections the network makes. divided by all the detections that it makes. And then recall is the number of correct detections versus the number of actual birds in the image. So together, these two metrics basically describe the performance of the network, and you can generate this curve. So as you increase precision, so your model is more likely, the detections from your model are more likely to be correct, you're going to decrease your recall, so it's going to miss some of the birds. And as you increase your recall and you're more likely to capture all the birds, the model is going to start making more and more errors, false detections as well. So you end up with a curve like this. So if you take the area under that curve, that's called the average precision. That's a major metric that people use to describe the performance of this tool. And that would be for one class, for example, Australian pelican. So we have 96 different classes, 82 species, and a few different age categories. So if we average the average precision over all of those classes, we end up with the mean average precision. So the mean average precision is just one number that describes the performance of that network. And it's built up in the way that kind of we just went through there. So it's a little bit confusing, but at least now you have some kind of idea of what I'm talking about when I go into the next slide. So my network had a mean average precision of 0.87, so that's out of 1, which is pretty good for bird detection. So, and then for classifying the birds into different species, that performance dropped a bit, but it's still good. And in particularly for some species, we see that the performance stays really high. So this plot down the bottom shows the average precision for all the different classes that we have. So you can see for some of the species on the left-hand side of that plot, like lesser black-backed gull, European herring gull, Australian pelican, we have really high performance, both for the test set and the validation set. Cool. And then up the top, we just have some examples of the outputs of the model. Okay, so then we went into deployment. So I'm going to try and use this model now. So I've put it onto an application, a web application. I've embedded it into the application. It's free to use. At the moment, it's private because the paper is still under revision. But once that paper comes out, this will be publicly accessible and free. Basically, there's just a little description up the top of how to use the tool. But we're going to upload some files, some images that I've taken from a drone. And then you can enter some information about those images. So what the resolution of the images are, what species are likely to be present in the image, and then some thresholds here associated with what score the network has to give a bird for it to classify as a bird rather than a background object, things like that. So I'm going to try and do this now. So I'm going to upload those images that we looked at earlier. So we have 3 images. We had the Australian pelicans, we had the Chilean flamingo, and we had the Gentoo penguins. So I've submitted that now. So this is running on a server somewhere in the world. And so now it's processing those images, and it'll go through, detect all the birds, and label their species as well. So I haven't had any computational resources, haven't had any computational skills, and I can jump on and use this tool straight away. So hopefully that means that the tool's adopted by practitioners, and they can have some confidence, at least trying it, feeling it out, using it, seeing how it performs compared to their current methods, and that sort of thing. So the first image takes a little bit longer because it was taken at a lower resolution, and the other 2 should be a bit quicker. And what it outputs is the images with little boxes around each of the birds, just to give you an idea of the performance. It also outputs the label file that you use to train the network. So you can actually use this to label data that then feeds back into a new version of the network. So that I used that a bit towards the end there, and that actually sped up labeling quite a bit. And then it also outputs a CSV, which has all the information. So what image it's looking at, where the bird, what species of bird it is, what score that bird got, and where the bird is within that image. So it's done now. So if I download this one. Okay, so here's our three images. We're going to look at the labeled ones. So the network's gone through and put boxes around all of these birds here and counted the Australian pelicans in there. We look at the one with the Chilean flamingo. You can see it's put boxes around, and the different coloured boxes represent the two different age categories. So around here, we've got a band of the juveniles, then we've got the breeding, the incubating adults in the middle, and then some of the non-incubating adults that might be feeding around the outside. And the Gen 2 penguin one, it's gone through and counted the Gen 2 penguins. So this is the results file. So you've got the name of the file here. So that was the name of the image I gave it. For each of the instances it detects, it tells you what it is. So Australian pelican adult in that first image, that's the score the network gave it. And this is the position in pixels, which if your image is auto-rectified, you can easily convert that into the GPS location of the birds as well. And then it also gives you the score for all the other species, so all the other classes, so the 96 other classes as well. Here it's very confident that it's Australian pelican, but in some instances it might be unsure whether it's two different species, so you can get that kind of more fine scale information as well. So something we can do pretty easily with this is just count the birds. So if I make a pivot chart like this, put these fields in here. Like that, we get a count out very quickly. So we can see in that first image, there was about 1,100 birds. Most of those were adults and with a few chicks. And then with the Chilean flamingo image, there's 717 birds, almost equal adult and chick distribution. And then the Gen 2 penguins, about 550 birds. So that's the sort of thing you can do in like a few minutes, whereas counting all the birds in those images might have taken, I don't know, a day or so manually. So the network performs, we tested the performance of the network on my local GPU, and it was 83 times faster than a manual person going through the images and labeling it. Cool. That is all. That's the end. I don't know how to get the presentation back up. I still can't use technology, but anyway. Yeah. So cool. There are those images, and then that's the last slide. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Josh. That's super interesting. I have heaps of questions, but if anybody on the floor has got any questions, we can open them up for Josh, and anybody online as well. Kate will relay that.
Yep. I was wondering if you looked at what factors affected why the performance was better for some species than others. What was influencing that?
Yeah, I started to go down that path, and it was a bit of a rabbit hole. I tried to kind of look at whether the plumage of the bird or the size of the bird or the background that it was on, and factors like that affected the performance of the model, resolution of the image. And I did find some effects using like, just basic statistic models. But I wasn't super kind of confident in the results. So it's something I want to look into more in the future, is kind of figuring out what impacts the performance of this model. Obviously, altitude of the drone is a massive one, so resolution of the image. If you can get high resolution images, you'll get better performance. And we actually kind of got some rough numbers from that as to what altitude you should fly your drone to detect birds based on the size of the bird. So if it's an Australian pelican, you can actually detect their species even if you're flying up at 120 meters. Whereas smaller birds like pied stilt, you're going to have to be down at about 40 or 50 meters. And that's with the kind of commercial off-the-shelf drones that you get for a couple of $1,000s. So we did look into that a little bit, mainly focusing on what altitude you need to fly. But it is something that I want to kind of go into more depth to see what the main predictors of that are.
That's super interesting.
Okay.
Lots of compliments online, lots of exclamation marks. That's really cool, great stuff, etc., etc. Hannah Fraser has a question. That's awesome. First of all, multiple explanation marks. If I have a data set with species that aren't in your current training set and/or with behaviours that aren't covered, is it possible to label my data up and use your model somehow?
Yeah. So the first thing is it's both a bird detector and a species classifier. So you can use it as just a bird detector. And because we have 82 different species, even if your species of bird is not already in the data set, it is likely to still perform well on your species because we have a bunch of different kind of phenotypes for birds, for morphologies. So for different bird species, it's probably going to still perform quite well. And you would check the performance of the network by manually labeling some of the data and comparing that. But I'm actually working right now. I've reached out to more researchers and got more data. So what I want to do is continue to incorporate more images, not only of birds, but of other species as well, to try and make kind of at least a really big general purpose drone survey data set that works on a bunch of different species. And then we can use that to kind of develop better computer vision models. So while Hannah maybe can't do it herself without like kind of the computational skills that you would need to acquire, but if they want to send it through to me, I can incorporate it into the data. And training takes 3 days, which is a while, but in the grand scheme of things, I can incorporate a new species. If you've got the labeled data, I can incorporate a new species within 3 days and have it back on that app ready to go. So that's kind of what I want to do moving forward, is keep making that data set encompass more context and more species.
She says 3 days is so fast and awesome. I have some collaborators at TNC have some data that I don't know how to analyse, so I can put them in touch.
Okay, cool.
Great.
Yeah.
First off, super interesting. Love to see what you're doing and making it openly available. But I'm curious if you thought much about scalability. Like I can see this being a really useful tool for a lot of the parks and wildlife folks along the coast of Queensland. You know, could they all hop on this website today and start uploading images?
Yeah, I haven't, because it's been private the whole time.
Oh, yeah.
I haven't tested how many people can access it at once, but the technology behind it is this. It's like a serverless technology, so it basically has a bunch of GPUs waiting to start up, and depending on how much use your app's getting, it'll start up more GPUs and take more resources. So it should be able to scale up, but I don't know. We'll see how it goes. But I think probably ultimately, if governments and things like that would want to adopt this technology, they'd probably want to have their own, like I know the Australian government likes to have its own kind of server somewhere that they're using. So I think probably if it was to be used by Parks and Wildlife Service and things like that, they might just take the model or just take the data and use their own server to kind of run it. But this at least gives kind of the everyday practitioners the access to the tool.
Nice.
Yeah.
Awesome stuff, Josh. Was it hard to get enough training data for like some of those species of conservation concern, like the eastern curlews and that sort of thing, to be able to pick them up reliably?
Yeah, so that is one of the predictors of performance that we kind of spoke of earlier. How many instances you have of that species. And for some species, we don't have very many instances, so the performance is lower. And for eastern curlew, I didn't get any images of them because they hate drones, which was the first chapter of my PhD. So yeah, some species are more susceptible to disturbance and things like that, and that limits your ability to get the data as well. So yeah, if you have limited data for a species, it's not going to perform as well. But yeah, over time, hopefully we can expand the context and get more species included. Yes, you.
Maybe I missed it, but have you incorporated like a location filter for the classification result so that we won't have like Chile and flamingo in Australia?
Yeah, I did look into that a little bit. What I decided to do instead is just have that bar down the bottom where you can actually select what species are likely to be in the image. So what I did in my last chapter where I was doing surveys in Moreton Bay is I just downloaded a list of all the species that are likely to be present in Moreton Bay, and you actually don't have to enter them all with that bottom bar. You can upload it as a CSV as well. as a species list, and the model will use that species list and say, okay, we know that it's only these species. So rather than trying to extract the GPS location from the image or use distributions, because there's vagrant birds and all that sort of stuff, it kind of gets a bit muddy. I just went, I'm going to let the practitioner enter what birds they think are likely to be in the site, and that can improve the performance of the model. So it's been restricted from detecting penguins in the Atlantic. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you upload individual images, or would you upload the orthophoto of the whole island? Like,
so
because it gets a bit fuzzy when you make the orthophotos, like can it still work on that?
Yeah. So it still works on orthophotos. You want to just make sure you try and retain as much as the resolution as you can and avoid the distortion artifacts that you sometimes get with creating orthomosaics. So it's just making decisions when you do the actual drone survey about how much overlap you have and what altitude you fly to make sure that once you've created that orthomosaic, the quality is high enough that the network will still be able to kind of detect the birds. Some people have done orthomosaics and the birds move between the shots and things like that, and all of that just, you know, decreases the performance of the accuracy of your survey. So there's different survey methods that work better in different contexts. But yeah, if you can get an orthomosaic of the whole island of good quality birds that have not moved around too much, you can upload it to this and it'll do exactly what it normally does. You can also upload a whole folder of images. So you don't have to upload one image, which is what we kind of just did. We uploaded 3 images at once, and it'll just slowly tick through each of those images in the whole photo. So in the whole folder. So if you've done a survey, for example, a transect survey where you've just got a line of images and maybe there's 200 images in that line, you just upload all those images and it'll just go through and detect all the birds in those images and tell you all that information that we looked at. So yeah, but you can also upload one big orthomosaic and it'll work as well. Yeah. So what it does is it takes that orthomosaic and splits it into smaller patches and then passes each of those patches to the GPU to make sure it doesn't run out of memory. And yeah, there's a bunch of stuff that happens in the background to make it be able to do that, but yeah, it'll work.
So I'm thinking about rerunning, you mentioned about rerunning the underlying model, you know, retraining it with new and additional data sets. Can you imagine a future in which the data that people upload are retained by the platform and then used for those reruns, kind of in the same way that iNaturalist works? I mean, that would be cool, right?
Yeah, I you know, had that idea at the start, and that was something I wanted to work towards, but I haven't got there yet. But that would be really cool, to be able to save the data. I don't think I can do it on that website, and also I'm worried about people just uploading weird, strange things. So I'm still thinking about it. But yeah, I would love it if like people could upload their survey images, and then I could use that to retrain a new model and make that process kind of closed loop, so it just keeps improving. Yeah, I'd like to work towards that.
Need a big grant.
Yeah.
Another question online. I can't identify this person, but their question is, first of all, super awesome research. I'm working on a drone database of Chinese waterfowl, but because some waterfowl have fewer numbers or are very responsive to drones, the data is very long-tailed across different species. I'd like to ask if there are any solutions or suggestions.
Yeah, so that was that slide on that constraint optimization problem. There's a few different options. The first option is just train it on the skewed data and then test its performance. The second option is downsampling. So you can take the more common species and drop a few of the images with those more common species in them so that you even out the data in that way. Or you can upsample the less common species. So take those images of the less common species and maybe augment them in some way. So maybe rotate them or change their color slightly and try and make them a little bit novel compared to the original image. And then upsample it so that you don't have that bias as well. And in that way you can decrease the bias among classes. So I use a downsampling method by finding out what birds were in each of the images and then using that optimization algorithm to say, how can I sample these images so that I downsample the really common ones, so that we have less bias in our data set. Yeah, so they're kind of the three different methods. Yeah.
All right, if there's no more questions, we can thank Josh for presenting.